Hi, welcome to the first edition of Conversation Coach. Today I'm not your teacher, I'm acting as your coach. I want to give you some advice on really how to improve your conversation skills. So these are strategies, these are how-tos. I'm not going to give you a lot of stuff to learn and memorize. No, I want to give you some really concrete ideas, things that you must do if you really want to improve your conversation skills. So in this episode, it's a bit long. I'm going to share with you a little bit of theory, the different methods that we use to learn English, or the different methods that teachers use to teach English. You're going to be surprised at what you learn. It's a very short session, it's a bit of theory, but you need to know this so that you know why you haven't been able to learn fluent English. It's not your fault. Okay? So here we go. Let's get started with the first episode of Conversation Coach. First, I want to begin this session by asking you a question. Have you ever taken lessons in listening in your native language? Have you ever taken listening lessons in your native language? Think about that. And then answer this question. Have you ever taken grammar lessons in your native language? I want you to think about that. And then I'll come back. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you some of the methods that are used to teach English, and there's quite a few of them. I'm just going to highlight 5 or 6 of them, and then I'm going to give you some explanation as to how you can use a method that's more effective for you to develop English fluency and conversation, fluent conversation. So here are the methods. So here are some different ways we learn English. Basically, there are 4 ways that are most popular and most well known, and these are the direct method, the structural approach, audiolingual, and grammar translation. Let me give you some details on all 4 methods. The direct method. In this method of teaching is done entirely in the target language. The learner is not allowed to use his or her mother tongue. Grammar rules are avoided, and there is an emphasis on good pronunciation. Typically, a direct method classroom will have 6 to 8 students so that the teacher can concentrate on the students' pronunciation. This method requires small numbers. This method is quite costly, as you can imagine, because there's a small classroom. The structural approach. This method sees language as a complex set of grammatical rules, which are to be learned one at a time in a set order. So, for example, the verb to be is introduced and practiced before the present continuous tense, which uses to be as an auxiliary. So this is a very structured approach, but very technical. Audiolingual. The theory behind this method is that learning a language means acquiring habits. It's the way we learn to speak our native language. It starts with speaking. So there's a lot of practice of dialogues for different situations. New language is heard, then it's extensively drilled before you learn the written form. So the emphasis is on listening and speaking. So some of the methods that use audiolingua, which you can do by yourself, is Pimsleur or Berlitz, which has schools around the world. They use a method which is basically audiolingual. And finally, grammar translation. Learning is largely by translation to and from the target language. Grammar rules are to be memorized and long lists of vocabulary learned by heart. This is probably very familiar to you. There is little or no emphasis placed on developing oral ability. Let me repeat that. There is little or no emphasis placed on developing oral ability. Bad news, 90 to 95% of schools, English learning centers use grammar translation as the method. They use books and materials that are based on grammar translation. Here are a few more obscure, lesser known methods. TPR, which is total physical response, I actually helped a friend of mine start the American TPR school in 1992 in Zhuhai, China, and they used the TPR method. But now they've diversified from that because there's a limitation to how much you can learn using the TPR method. Suggestopedia, I've done another video, you can look at that. That involves a method using music. Very effective for learning vocabulary and chunks of information. Immersion is a little bit different than the direct method. Immersion usually is 24 hours a day. You will sleep, eat, and drink English. Your teachers sometimes even live with you throughout the entire experience. So this can last a week to 2 weeks to a month, and you hear nothing but English in class, on TV, films, at parties. Everything is done in English. And the last method is called the silent way. The silent way is probably the most obscure and least known method. It's quite powerful, it's quite effective. The reason it's called the silent way is actually the teacher does very little speaking. He encourages the students to speak more, and then he makes corrections to their grammar and structure. So these are the methods that are most commonly used to teach English throughout the world. Now here's the strange thing. With all these methods that have been developed 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, 5 years ago, even maybe 2 years ago, schools still use one method, this method. They're stuck on it. Why are they stuck on the one method when there are so many methods? One, system. You ever try to change a school system and the way they teach? Means you have to get all new books, you have to change the way the teachers teach, you have to train the teachers to teach in that way. It's easier to stick to the old system. The system, the English system that we have in 95% of schools today, still based on this old method. Why do they still use it if people can't learn to speak using this method? Very simple. Economics. They want to be able to teach the most people in the shortest period of time. What they teach is questionable. So if you notice, they focus on grammar, composition, rules. Why is that? Because it's teacher friendly. Teacher can make multiple choice tests and exams, and if you get it all correct, you can pass. But it will not make you a communicative English speaker. But it's good for the system because teachers can teach easily. They can mark the papers easily, and you pass the test and you feel good. But you're still not a communicative speaker. Quite frankly, we would say it's not learner friendly. It's teacher friendly. It's made for the teacher, it's made for the school. The other thing is you have to understand the economics of time. You've got a 60-minute period once a week with your English students. So if you're a teacher and you've got, say, 25 students, did you ever do the math? Even if you wanted to teach them how to speak in a 60-minute session, you can give each student 2 minutes to talk, maximum. So even at 50 weeks a year, 2 minutes a week, you're not really going to learn to be communicative. You're not going to learn to speak. And you're definitely not going to learn how to listen effectively. It's too short a period. So again, easier to focus on grammar, rules, composition, make you write an essay, all the things that's easy for a teacher to mark and easy for them to give you a grade. Pass or fail. And I've seen the weakness of the system because I've seen people who failed English terribly, and yet they can communicate very well in class. They can carry a conversation very well. And I've seen other students who passed, got A plus, 90s in their English lessons, couldn't answer, how are you? They just look at you. So the school system, God bless it, it's great. You know, we all have to start somewhere, but it's definitely not good for communicative English. I always like to explain it in another way. It's like going to learn swimming in a swimming pool, but they don't give you a swimming suit. They get you to sit in chairs along the swimming pool. And then The first week, the teacher will come in and say, today I want to tell you all about what you need to go swimming. First, you need a swimming suit. Shows you the swimming suit. This is a swimming pool. This is the shallow end. This is the deep end. The water is full of chlorine, so you don't get germs. Over here is the diving board. The deep end is so deep. The shallow end is so shallow. This is a flutter board. This is the kick stroke. This is the breaststroke. They show you all these things, but you never go in the swimming pool and swim. That's like teaching you grammar. You learned all the rules of grammar, but what use is it? What can you do with it? So English in school is very much like that. You're learning how to swim without swimming, which is kind of funny, right? So again, don't blame yourself that you can't speak English. All right? Again, I want to go back to the fact that it's not your fault. Now, I asked you earlier, how many lessons did you take in listening in your native language? And most of you said, oh, that's really silly. I never took any listening lessons in my native language. Fact is, you did. For a year and a half, you never said anything. And as a baby, all you did was listen. 2,500 to 3,000 hours of listening in your native language. That's how you acquired vocabulary. That's how you learned grammar. That's how you learned basic sentence structure. Listening for 2,500 to 3,000 hours. Have you done that in English? No. Guaranteed. English classes, do the math. You have 50 hours a year for 15 years. How much listening is that? And if your classes were in your native language, very little. You're probably looking at maybe 40 hours of exposure to actual listening in English. You need 2,500 hours of exposure in your native language, 50 hours of exposure of listening to English. You think you're going to get good vocabulary? You think you're going to learn sentence structure by memorizing grammar rules? No. You really need to get on to listening more. And my suggestion, my first tip today is really learn your listening. Really improve your listening. Become an effective listener in English. And the only way you can do that is by listening. And if you go watch a movie at home, turn off the damn subtitles. Really, those subtitles are hindering you from becoming an effective listener. Because you know how to read, you probably studied that in school, you like to read the subtitles, but it's really bad for your listening skills. Did you do that as a baby? Did you say, hey, mommy, daddy, turn on the subtitles, I can't understand you? No, because now you understand so much in your native language, you want to understand everything that's in the movie as well. So again, very natural, but you need to get rid of the subtitles. You really need to learn to listen, and you listen until you can understand. My recommendation is if you're watching a movie or a TV series and you have it on your computer or on your phone, watch 10 to 15 minutes. Maybe you don't understand anything. Then play it again, 10 to 15 minutes. And then again, and again, and again. Maybe not one day, but 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Problem most people have is they keep watching more and more, and they think, if I watch more, I'm going to get better. No. If you listen to more and you don't understand, it's not going to get you anywhere. So my recommendation, and I've given this advice to students and they found it very effective, 10 to 15 minute bites of a movie, pieces of a movie. Watch it over and over and over again. And try to find scenes where people are having a natural dialogue, like in a coffee shop or in a restaurant, or people just speaking to each other on the street. Natural conversation. That's how you will really learn to really effectively listen. The other trick is learn to be a spy. So if you're going to a dinner or a cocktail hour and you hear two people speaking in English, don't be so anxious to go in and join them and speak. Just kind of listen to what they're saying. Just listen in to what they're saying and see if you can understand what they say. Eavesdrop, be like a spy. And then later when you go to the washroom or you stand aside, you can actually make notes of words you didn't understand, look them up in your English to English dictionary, and then your listening will improve over time. But it does take time, 2,500 to 3,000 hours possibly, to really develop fluent listening. And you need to develop fluent listening before you develop fluent speaking. It's been said that when you speak, you're only saying what you know. But when you listen, you're learning new things, such as vocabulary. That's how you build your vocabulary. You learn to listen to other people's words, and you try to speak less. Okay? Tip number 2, dump your dictionary. Yeah, Dump your native language to English or English to native language dictionary. I had a student 35 years ago. He always had his dictionary with him. Every time I said something he didn't understand, he looked it up. But it was an English to Chinese dictionary. I had this student 35 years later. He still had the same habit. English to Chinese dictionary. I asked, has your vocabulary improved any? Kind of looked at me and then he said, not really. He said, but your translation skills gotten better. And he laughed. And that's really what you're doing. Most of us don't want to learn to be translators. The only person that really needs a English to native language dictionary is a translator, because they're learning translation. If you really want to learn to speak English, if you want to improve your vocabulary, get yourself an English to English dictionary. I highly recommend a learner's dictionary. And don't say, oh, I'm going to get the advanced dictionary. No need. Just get yourself a basic learner's dictionary. I highly recommend Collins Learner's Dictionary. It's very, very good. They even give you lists of words that are commonly used. So you should learn those words first, not start at A and go to B and then go to C. Learn the common words, the 1,000 most common words, and work your way down, and then you will improve your vocabulary in English. You know, the brain likes to go English to native language. And you have this middle here, right? And that's where you get in trouble. And if you're using this English, what I call the English loop, where you have the English come in, you translate it to your native language, you translate it back into English, and the answer comes out, your English is going to sound funny. The problem with that is it's slow. And the second thing is when the questions get longer and longer, your translation skills are like, what did the guy say? Because you're still trying to translate the question. You need to learn to listen in English, understand in English, and then give the answer in English. That's how you develop fluency. In the short term, it's much more difficult. But in the long term, you'll get much better results. And that's what you need to do. And again, if you go back to what I said in the first tip, learn to listen. So if you listen to the question and then you listen to the answer, you'll see how people structure an answer. You'll learn how they create the answer. And you'll learn to improve your vocabulary. So those two tricks, those two things you learn, so those are two things that you must do if you really want to improve. And the third thing, for vocabulary, don't learn lists and lists of words. Brain research tells us the brain likes to learn in pairs, in combinations. I highly recommend learning collocations. Collocations are word pairs, words that come naturally together. So we always say things like, the bride wore a flowing gown. The gown doesn't have to be flowing, but newspaper reporters always say the bride wore a flowing gown. We don't know why. And so a lot of words come in combinations like that. So for example, we say, it was a golden opportunity. We say, there's a cool breeze in here. These are all words that are collocated. They come together in combinations. Learning words in combinations are easier to remember because they come in pairs. And when you want to become fluent, this is how you develop natural speech, because you're not doing sentences by word, by word, by word. You're doing them in chunks. So instead of how are you, you learn how are you, right? You learn it as a group. You learn it as a chunk. The weather was fine today. So you don't learn the weather was fine today. You learn fine today. The weather was fine today. So you learn that combination. Much more easy. It's much more easy for you to sound and become fluent, because collocations give you an edge, and you're learning groups of words which your brain likes and can remember much more easily. Likewise, phrasal verbs. And phrasal verbs is something I really try to get my students to learn and understand. In English, we know there's 10,000 phrasal verbs. Just the verb come at, come in, come between, come for, come by, come with. We have 50 phrasal verbs. Go with, go between, go at, go for, go. Another 50 phrasal verbs. Now, you're not going to memorize 50 phrasal verbs for each verb. It's too much trouble. So again, use that first tip I talked about. When you listen to someone else's conversation, listen for phrasal verbs and then try to guess the meaning. Yep, guessing is a very valuable skill. English teachers say reading, writing, speaking, and listening. on top of that, I recommend guessing. Learning to guess scientifically is a good way to improve phrasal verbs, for example. You know, people say, how come the native speaker knows all the phrasal verbs? He doesn't, or she doesn't. But they're very good at guessing the meaning based on the rest of the sentence. And that's a skill you need to develop. And if you can improve your skill 30%, 40%, 50%, move it up to 70, 80, 90%, you can guess the meaning, you can understand most phrasal verbs. And over time, you will learn to use them as well. Okay? So first, learn to listen and understand. Secondly, learn to use. Most people are too impatient. They try to use the phrasal verbs as soon as they learn them. That's not always a good idea because you can't always use the phrasal verb for the right situation. Okay? Final point, idioms. A lot of students, they say they want to memorize idioms. I've had students, they say they want to speak idiomatic English, so they memorize idioms. Problem with idioms is if you don't use the idiom correctly, and idioms have to be used 100% correctly, all the words have to line up like a collocation. All 4 words, all 5 words have to be together. You can't change one word for another. And if you muck it up, if you mess it up, you're going to sound like a fool. People won't understand you, and you're better to be clear about your communication. Use simple English, more clear. Okay? Maybe you won't sound so sophisticated, but people will understand you. Okay? So the secret with idioms is, yes, try to learn them, but the first time that you're trying to learn them, you're learning them so that you can understand when people use them. You learn idioms to use them later when you have a big bank of them, and then you know which one to use at which time. So don't be too anxious to use phrasal verbs. Vocabulary is very different. You're trying to learn a new word. It's a good idea to try to use it as soon as you can so that you can use it. But phrasal verbs, idioms, you learn them so that you can understand what other people are saying. And then later you can learn how to use them in the correct situation. So those are my 3 tips. Those 3 tips, you're on your way. You will really become more fluent more quickly. And those are things I'm sure you didn't learn in school. Bye-bye school English. Hello, English fluency. Bye for now. So that was quite a long session. I hope you got a lot out of it. This is the first session in Conversation Coach. It won't be the last session. One more question I want to ask you about dictionaries. Because people say, you know, I want to learn like a child learns. Well, I say go back a little further. Learn like how a baby learns. Remember I told you that it takes about 2,500 to 3,000 hours. When you were a baby, when you were 1 to 1.5 years old, you didn't say anything until finally you said mama or baba after a year and a half. 2,500 to 3,000 hours of listening to your native language before you said one word. And my question is this. Did you have a dictionary with you then? No. And yet your vocabulary in your native language is really probably fairly good. But you didn't learn it by carrying a dictionary and looking up the word. You learned your vocabulary basically by attentive listening. Why did you have attentive listening? Because you couldn't say anything. So when you start to speak, your listening skills get worse because now you can speak. And then you try to learn to speak better and better and better. So be careful with that. Listening is a much more important skill if you want to develop fluent English, because then you can understand, and then you develop your vocabulary, and then you have phrases in your head that you can use whenever you need to, and you will sound more natural. So bye for now. See you in the next session.